Okay, good afternoon. So during the duration of the presentation, during Q&A, please virtually raise your hand and wait to be acknowledged. You may unmute and show yourself when asking your questions. In case you don't want to forget the questions that you want to ask, you may also write them already on the chat box. Participants on Facebook, please post your questions in the comment sections and we will prioritize asking the questions with the most number of likes. Okay, let me introduce our speaker this afternoon, Dr. Arlen Brukhal. He is an applied microeconomist who studies topics in development economics, environmental economics, and industrial organization. He is a lecturer in economics at the University of Exeter Business School and a visiting fellow at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Hawaii at Manoa and his BS and MA from the University of the Philippines. He is here with us this afternoon to present his paper titled Damage by the Disaster, the Impact of COVID-19 on Firms in South Asia. Arlan, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those kind words. Nice introduction. Let me share my screen first. Is it working? Okay. So, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thanks for having me here. What I'll be presenting today for the seminar is a work in progress in collaboration with RT Grover and Santiago Ortega of the World Bank. And so what we're doing here is that we want to look at the impact of COVID-19 on firms in South Asia using this novel data set that I will be presenting shortly. By the way, if you have a burning question, clarifying questions, feel free to unmute and ask your questions, and I would be more than willing to clarify it as we move on. Okay, so for the outline of the presentation, we'll start with the motivation, like the usual. We ask why this is an important issue to study, and then we'll proceed with data and methods, and then we'll go straight to the results. The results are divided into several sections. First, we look at the impact of COVID-19 on firms in South Asia versus other regions. In particular, we'll be looking at operating status, or the probability of a firm remaining open. We looked at sales or change in sales during these during the time of the pandemic, and also financial fragility or the probability of entering into arrears or not being able to pay their liabilities. And then we have, after that, we'll proceed with the adjustments to the COVID-19. We'll look at employment adjustment, whether they resort to firing or mainly just reducing of the hours of work or providing leaves. In this case, we're looking at intensive margins. And then we look at changes in operating models. Do they resort to more digitalization or innovation in the product mix? And then we also look at actually the more important thing or part of the study, which is the heterogeneity of the impact. So we'll see whether there are differences in the impact depending on your export status, gender or ownership by gender, whether they're female-led or male-led, which is, I think, an increasingly important issue to look on, and also firm size. And then the last part of the result will be policy and targeting. In a sense, we will be looking at the access to firm support, whether a firm was able to get access to supports like delays in taxes or employment benefits. And then looking at targeting, meaning we'll look at we will be using the BPS data in order to somewhat inform the policy. So how do we design a policy based on the results that we have presented? And then we're going to end up with conclusion and policy recommendation. Okay, so first thing is, why is this an important thing to study on? I guess it's fairly obvious. COVID-19, and we know that its associated lockdowns had caused serious health and economic damages. I don't have a PhD in medicine, and so I will leave the health part behind, but we'll be focusing on economic damages. And so we probably know that the global economy in 2020, as recorded by the World Bank, contracted by 4.3%. And then many countries went into economic recessions, both advanced and developing countries. And also millions of workers lost their jobs. And at some point, including their household, they were brought back to poverty, or they were actually tipped to poverty. And then investment was really affected. I mean, up to now, maybe as you look at the investment indices like the Nikkei and the NYSE, you would see that some of them are probably recovering, but the FTSE, or the London-based stock exchange, is still in the negative region, meaning it's still lower than the pre-COVID levels. So investment were really severely affected. And then, of course, we're aware that there are local business closures, and so they're really prevalent. But more recent data shows that the effect is somewhat deeper in South Asia. And so the regional dip in terms of GDP growth is actually higher by 5.4%, so it's higher than the global average. And then majority of the countries were in recession. So the Maldives posted 28% decline in GDP, so that's a huge decline, a major recession. And then, as because of this, government responded with a number of interventions. So there were delays in taxes and debt services to increasing liquidity, like macroeconomic policies. But then these were done within the presence of pre-existing fiscal stress and also socioeconomic challenges. And so basically what's happening here is that there's a risk of reversing advances in sustainable development. And so they were growing beforehand pre-COVID, but then because of this shock, there's a tendency that this trend would be reversed, and worse, there will be a deepening of existing vulnerability and equity problems. And so definitely there's an increasing need to really look at the implication of what would be the implication of these damages to policies and eventually to trajectory in terms of economic growth. So what we do in this paper is that we use this novel, let's say novel because they just did it during the pandemic, this global firm level data with more than 100,000 firms. So it covers 30 countries for business pulse survey. So this is the survey that was done, really designed to look at the impact of the pandemic. And then 21 countries were from the World Bank Enterprise Surveys. And so these surveys contain modules on operation of the firm, whether they're operating or not. There's an effect on COVID-19 on sales and employment. There's the channels affecting the operation of the firm, whether it's a demand shock or a supply shock. There's a response by the firm, meaning what are the adjustments made, and also there are questions about access to public support. So what we're doing here is that we actually want to answer three core questions. First is the big elephant in the room is that what is the magnitude? Like how big are we really talking about here? What's the magnitude of the impact of the COVID-19 and its associated lockdowns on South Asian firms relative to those in other regions and countries? And then we want to also answer the question, how are South Asian firms adjusting to COVID-19 related economic disruptions? And then, of course, we want to also know the role of policy in supporting South Asian firms during the crisis and recovery. And so for the method, it's basically very simple. We didn't even bother to write down equations, but essentially we just run a simple OLS and probability regressions with a bunch of controls, namely size, subsector, stringency index, that's coming from the Oxford, just measuring how government responded to the pandemic. We also control for the number of weeks after the peak because the survey were done in different time periods, and so we want to look at how far are they from the drastic drop in the mobility in terms of it's essentially measuring the lockdown, or how far are you from the lockdown. We also look at we also control for population and also region fixed effects. And so what we're doing here is that for every regression, we're just calculating predictive margins. And so if you're not familiar with the idea is that for each regression, I mean, you can actually predict y hat. And then what you will do is that for the variable of interest that you want to look at, you're just going to predict the y hat, uh, given what's the level of excess for in the data set, and then you use the counterfactual, meaning what if the variable of interest, for example, is 1 and 0, and so you run the prediction with x equal to 1, and then you run the prediction again based on x equal to 0, and then you calculate the difference. And so what you will see in the next slides are the predictive margins that we plot in the figure, and that's where we base our analysis on. And then for us to know whether what explains the variance that we were actually interested on, we also calculated the Shapley value. So essentially, what the Shapley value is that when you run a regression, basically you will be able to calculate the R square, right? Which is, the percentage, the share of the variance that is explained by the model. And so what we're doing in the Shapley value is that you can actually decompose the R square based on the share of the variables in terms of the variance. And so what you want to do is you want to explain the marginal contribution of each regressor in terms of its share in the R square. And so basically the idea is you want to know what really explains the variation of the dependent variable in each regression. And so we plot those marginal contribution in order to know whether this variable or which variable is actually contributing the most in terms of explaining the variance of the dependent variable. And so based on this very simple method, of course, it comes with limitation. First is, we're just presenting stylized facts, and therefore we are agnostic. So we remain agnostic all throughout the paper in terms of the direction of causality. So we're not really interpreting anything into causality, but these are just mere correlations. Now, let's get into the results. First, we want to look at the impact of COVID-19 on firms in South Asia versus other regions. And so what we first see is that when we look at the status of operation, firms in South Asia actually have lower probability of being open during COVID-19. So as you can see in the y-axis, you have the probability of being open in terms of percentage change. So these are the predictive margins. And on the horizontal axis, you have the region. So SAR is the South Asia region, if you're not familiar with the World Bank acronyms. So SSA is the Sub-Saharan Africa. Non-high income these are the developing countries based on World Bank definition, excluding South Asia region. EAP or EAP is the East Asia and the Pacific, which includes the Philippines, and the advanced economies or the high income. So here it's very obvious that in terms of the average probability of being open, firms in South Asia have actually the lowest probability. And so in essence, you can interpret this as business closures in South Asia are much more prevalent relative to other regions. Now, in terms of sales, firms in South Asia witnessed the largest declines. And so, again, on the vertical axis, you have the change in sales. And so here, the question is, we asked the firm, and then the question is, in the past months from April to say September in 2020, how much change in sales you observe? And so it could range from negative 100% to 100% positive. And so what you see here is that controlling for a lot of things like number of weeks after the peak, firm size, subsector, income groups, and others, you see that the decline in the sales is actually larger for South Asia, and it's significant. So you have the 95% confidence interval here, and so basically the general rule is that if they don't overlap, it's unlikely that they are significantly different. And so the dip is actually highest for South Asia, and it's much larger compared to sub-Saharan Africa and also to East Asia region. Now, what about financial fragility? Meet their responsibility, or is that liability or responsibility? Anyway, 66% of them were fell into arrears, and that is actually significantly higher relative to sub-Saharan Africa and other regions. And so, based on these three slides, you will see that perhaps firms in South Asia actually were impacted a lot deeper than those in the rest of the world. Now, based on this impact, how are firms adjusting to COVID-19 shocks? So here we looked at employment on the intensive margin. So they don't really fire workers, but they are resorting to, say, reducing wages or reducing hours or giving forced vacation leaves. Now, you have to take this with caution, because the timing of the survey was done during the time of the pandemic, so it's in the early stage. So we haven't gotten the data for wave 2, which is towards the end of the pandemic. So this is actually at the beginning, and so most likely what you're seeing here is that they are sort of retaining their employment at the moment, and also doing sort of a wait and observe. But of course, in the long run, when financial constraints have crept in, and then there were lots of either paying the capital, the rental costs and all that, and so the financial constraints are becoming more serious, and so we don't know in the long run if this is still going to be the case. And so in wave 2, we want to look at whether this trend actually changed. But relative to other regions, we're seeing that the adjustment for South Asia are more into the intensive margin relative to the extensive margin. Now, what about digitalization? So one of the trends brought upon by the pandemic is that there's a tendency to what they call reallocation shock, and so some goods have becoming more appealing, and some goods, but somehow the others are lagging behind because of lack of infrastructure that would enable digitalization. We also see that it's also lagging innovation, and so SAR in the region, the probability of innovating their product and services is actually lower compared to sub-Saharan Africa and also other developing countries. And so seems like South Asian are not adjusting that much in terms of changing their operations model relative to other regions. Now, we're now looking at the heterogeneity of the impact. And so I'm not sure if you're familiar, but if you look at the literature, the consensus, at least from the review that I had, is that this shock is actually different from the previous in terms that there's huge heterogeneity of the impact. And so different groups are shouldering most of the burden relative to others. And so it could be depending on where sector you are, or depending on what societal group you're in, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we're going to look at is whether, within groups, do we observe heterogeneity of impact, which is also important when we design policies to intervene and help firms on their way to the recovery. Okay, so in the region, what we see here is that exporters are more resilient. And so here we looked at the probability of being open, but we classify or we group observations based on whether they're exporter or not. And so the probability of being open is actually higher for exporters relative to non-exporter. And so now you would surmise that, of course, this is probably expected. And why? Because exporters are more productive. They have links to the outside market. And so most likely they are quite resilient. But of course, it also could be related to the networks. And we shall see that this is connected to other results that look at the advantage of having networks, like if you're a male-led or female-led firm. So this is also looking at exporter and importer. So relative to other firms, exporters are slightly low risk of falling into arrears. And again, that's probably expected. Based on networks, exporters are more connected, and so they have more access to financial instruments relative to non-exporters. And so you would expect that in general, they are slightly low risk of falling in arrears. But what's striking here is that the difference between exporter and non-exporter is more pronounced in South Asia relative to other regions. Now, here we look at the differences in terms of the probability of being open, but comparing men-led and women-led. And so how do we define women-led and men-led? So in the questionnaire, we ask for the gender of the respondent and also the position of the respondent. And so if the respondent is a female and then his position is a CEO or manager or the owner of the firm, then we can conclude that, or we can categorize that this firm is actually women-led. And of course, it's men-led otherwise. And here so we look at the probability of being open, and generally what you see here is that those firms that are women-led have lower probability of being open, so there are more business closures in women-led firms, and that's probably expected. And why? Especially in South Asia, women-led firms are mostly in the micro industry and also in the informal industry, and so they have less access to financial instruments. They're more vulnerable to shocks, etc. And so in here we see that they're more fragile based on in terms of their operating status. We also look at different firm size. There should be financial fragility here, but we also find that female-led firms have a higher probability of entering into arrears. I thought I included it in this slide. Anyway, then we also group observations whether they are micro and small, meaning if their employment is between 0 and 19, or whether they're medium and large, or if they have employment 20 plus or 20 or more. And so what we see here is that in terms of operational status, the probability of being open is generally lower for micro and small firms, and that's probably very intuitive. But what's striking here is that the difference in the SAR region is more pronounced relative to the other region. And so we see here that the heterogeneity of the impact is probably higher or more visible or more evident in South Asia relative to other regions. Now, in terms of policy and targeting, first thing that we need to look at is whether firms in South Asia have access to public support. So public support, in the questionnaire, we asked whether they were able to receive tax holidays or unemployment benefits. And so what we see here is that the probability of accessing support is actually lower in SAR. It's significantly lower, and it's almost equivalent to those in the Sub-Saharan Africa. And then relative to East Asia and the Pacific, which include the Philippines, the probability of accessing support is significantly lower, and much more relative, of course, to the high-income countries. Now here, this is, I think, the first part where we talk about the Shapley value. And so here we want to look at the contribution of different variables like size, subsector, exporter status, and shock suffered, meaning if they suffered demand shock or supply shock. And how do we characterize demand shock or supply shock? Well, in the questionnaire, there's a question about whether they have a reduction in employment, and so that can be considered a supply shock, or whether there is a reduction in the sales, which in this case is it's a characterization of a demand shock. And so what we see here is that in terms of the Shapley value, or the contribution to the variance, or the variability of the dependent variable, we see that policy preference, meaning if you look at when we ask the firms what policies they prefer, the variations is actually explained pretty much by the shock suffered, right? So that's the contributing factor. But when we look at the policy received, so this is the gray part, gray bars, we see that size and subsector are actually the ones that are explaining the most of the variation. So we interpret this as saying that there might be a mismatch in terms of policy targeting. And so we see that there's heterogeneity in preferences, and what explains their preferences are actually shocks. So depending on their shocks, they would probably want a different policy. But what we observe is that based on the policy received, or so the provision of policy is actually driven by size and subsector. And that's probably intuitive. And why? Because this was done at the very early stage of the pandemic. And so the goal is actually to stop the increase in unemployment. And so what is easy, and what is probably easier in terms of administrative concern, is that you target the policy based on what you can easily observe, which is in this case is size and subsector. But of course, when we look at the policy preference, it's actually driven by what type of shock they actually experience. And when we look at the heterogeneity as well, so here we want to look at, we want to take out the effect of size and subsector. And so in here, you look at the distribution of change in sales. And so in the what color is this? In the sky blue, or the light blue one, this is the variation between country size subsector averages in South Asia. The dark blue is other countries, excluding SAR. And then the dashed line are the variation controlling for subsector and size. And so what we see here is that if you net out the variation in change in sales using size and subsector, there's still a lot of unexplained heterogeneity. And so the idea here is that even within size and sector subgroupings, there's still a wide variation of change in sales. And so the way we want for our own sanity is that we try to look at the country level. And so I don't have it here, but in Pakistan, we looked at a particular industry or a subsector, and then we look at a particular group, micro and small firms. And within that, we see huge variations in the change in sales, ranging from negative 60 up to positive 20. And so the idea here is that if we use size and subsector as our main instrument to target policy, there's a tendency that you might be providing support to those that who actually don't need it, or to those who are probably going to be viable. So in essence, there may be some redundancy, and they may be better off being offered to other firms, but probably in different size and subsector groups. And so, yes, just to repeat, there's large variations within the group. So therefore, there's still a lot of unexplained variation, even if you net out the effect of size and subsector in the analysis. Okay, so here we just look at change in sales again. And so here we calculate the Shapley value, and we see that most of the variations in global settings, around 62% of the within country variations in sales and change is attributed to the type of shock, right? So depending on the shock that they experience, that will determine how much of the decline in sales they're gonna incur. And size, so size and subsector account, and also exporter status as well. Those those variables that we often see that policymakers use in order to target beneficiaries, they only explains 20% of the variations, and the big elephant in the room is actually the type of shock that they suffered. Now, of course, it's probably harder to observe this unless you have a really good data set. But what we are seeing here is that perhaps on the way to recovery, there may be a need to sort of customize or improve the policy targeting that is happening at the from level. Okay. Wow, I'm already in the last slide. So, based on those stylized facts, what we have observed first is that, okay, this should be conclusion. Um, so what we see here is that in terms of the damages, there's a massive impact of COVID-19 among South Asian firms. And we see that perhaps the impact to them is actually deeper based on business closures, based on declines in sales, or based on financial fragility. There's also, in terms of adjustments, we see that firms in South Asia are less likely to use digital platforms. So they don't really resort to more digitalization and also innovation in terms of the product mix. So they don't really diversify production, at least relative to those firms in other regions. In terms of access to public support, South Asia is low. And so I wasn't able to present it, but we also looked at what explains the lack of access to public support, and we find that it's mainly lack of awareness, which explains the gap in public support, and also business networks. And so based on what we have seen, those that have low levels of public support are the ones that are female-led, and also those that are non-exporters. And so this provides a sort of support to the conjecture that perhaps business 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 networks could actually be helpful in dealing with shocks. Now, also I wasn't able to present the effect of policy support, and we in the paper, if you download the working paper, we see that public support actually improves business outlook. So in terms of uncertainty and expected change in sales in the future, the higher the provision of public support, the higher the outlook, or the more positive the outlook is. However, when we look at financial fragility, there's a U-shaped curve. So the idea here is that perhaps this is also a reflection of mistargeting. And so there are those that are provided with support, but they still continue to have increasing financial fragility. And so here we see that probably these are the big firms or big hotels that are quite vulnerable and probably not going to be viable on in terms of the recovery stage. And so here we see that perhaps the policy support has been very redundant. So that's probably a manifestation of mistargeting of policy support. And so based on those results, we see that it can be effective, but there's got to be some sort of a customization. And why? Because the usual measure or the usual instrument that we use in order to target policies in our policy targeting is size and sector, which are imprecise targets, given the large heterogeneity of impacts within these groups. And so again, we argue that intervention within this group should consider the dominant channel of transmission of the shock. And there's a new paper published at the NBER right now, providing a model saying that it's not only the growth, but actually compounding it with demand shocks would actually explain the heterogeneity of the impact, which have implication at the aggregate level, which eventually could explain the differences in terms of how countries are recovering from the pandemic. And so our results are actually consistent with that theory. And in some way, we are providing some empirical evidence to support that theory. And I think that's all I have. And I'm open to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Arlan. Really interesting study. Arlan, can you unshare? I think I can unshare. Okay.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
So we can now entertain questions from the audience in Zoom or in Facebook. Anybody who would like to start? Everybody's still warming up. Okay, we have national scientist, Professor Raul Fabella. You yourself? Raul?
Yes,
Okay.
I haven't shown myself
Okay.
later.
Hi, Professor.
Hi, Arlen. The topic is extremely interesting. My own interest is resilience. And of course, among stakeholders or among firms, my interest is, of course, probably not covered by your study. What is how do conglomerates perform in a COVID pandemic? Conglomerates are large, of course, so you can say that your study, in a sense, has something to say because size is important for being able to weather the disturbance. But conglomerates are not only large, they are very diversified. So, for example, Metro Pacific announced its results for 2020, and they're actually quite good. Systems had in 2020 and 21.
Okay.
I more or less agree. I more or less agree with the size. I've always argued that we should have large corporations because large corporations are they have deep pockets and they have their connection with the financial sector is very deep, and they can always draw from those connections, and therefore they are less subject to volatilities. But the more important thing is, of course, my own concern is conglomerates. Okay. Your say, Arlen.
Wow, Professor, that's deep. I hope that I could answer that very well given the study. But as you said, what we're doing right now are just presenting stylized facts, and therefore these are very preliminary. And moving forward, as we get more data, we could look at in terms of dynamic adjustments, and then that will give us a better picture of how firms are actually impacted pre, during, and on its way to recovery. But just to respond to that question, I think there's a lot of moving parts here. And so first is the adjustments could be different depending on where you are and depending on what sector you're in. And so yes, size could be a determinant on whether you would be resilient or not. But in our experience, it's not usually the case. And so we have firms that are really big, but they are mostly in the tourism and hospitality sector. And these are really conglomerates. But because they are so susceptible to the lockdowns, these are the ones that have higher probability of entering into arrears. And so based on new data, actually, they have higher liabilities. And so again, this is sort of an evidence or an indication to say that, yeah, size could be one thing, but depending on the shocks that you experience, whether you're susceptible to demand shock or supply shocks, which the pandemic has actually both, And depending on how you received it, then most likely that will depend on how you would respond it and how you would survive the shock. Also, they have different adjustments, and so here we see that there's an effect of what they call in the literature reallocation shocks. And so these are the goods and services that become more appealing during the pandemic. So these are the IT related. If you have access to Amazon or Lazada, I think they are actually the winners, so to speak, in this era. While those that are dependent on interaction or close interactions with customers like hospitality or tourism or retail and services, then these are actually the most impacted ones. And so, yes, there's a lot of moving parts here, and depending, and what we see actually, even if we control for size and subsector, there's a huge heterogeneity in terms of the impact. And so those are the things that we want to dig deeper on, but I guess that will require more data collection. Hopefully that solves
Thank
that
you.
answers the question.
Thank you. Yes.
So Arlan,
And also foreign ownership. We haven't touched on the foreign ownership yet.
so Arlan, your data set, it contains that disaggregation because you mentioned you can identify hospitality firms in hospitality in other industries. So
Yes.
let's say
So we have sector. We have the major sector. We have the agriculture, services, tourism. No, not tourism. Generally speaking, regardless of what region you are, but it's mostly prevalent in South Africa and also in South Asia.
Okay. Okay. We have another question. Dr. Jeff Tocanes is raising his hand. Jeff, you may show yourself.
Hi, Jeff.
Jeff, we don't.
Mute. Unmute.
Quote for the year. You're muted.
I think that remove your headset. The connection, I think. You're not muted pero we don't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Okay, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. So Arlen, thank you for the very interesting presentation. So my question is, so you make a distinction between supply shock and demand shock on the companies, but your supply shock really is lack of employees. My only question is, how do you distinguish between the lack of employees because people are not able to go to work because of the lockdown, and the lack of employees precisely because there is no demand, so firms are not asking the employees to go to work?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I should clarify that I only mentioned decline in employment, but there's also in the questionnaire whether you experience decline in raw materials. And so if there's a disruption in the value chain, then that can be considered as a supply shock. So yes, it's a composite variable, not only employment. And so that's the result of bad presentation, not basically limitation of the data.
Okay. Jeff, are you still raising your hand?
And no more.
Okay.
It's a legacy, I think.
Okay. Any other question? Dr. Randy Tuanyo and then Dr. Nori Tarui.
Hi, Arlan. So thank you for your presentation. Sorry. Sorry, I missed the first part. I don't know if explain that if there are sort of country variations in terms of how the lockdown proceeded in each country, and are there country variations also in terms of the shocks that firms actually experience? And I don't know if maybe can you explain a little bit about the sort of policy responses? Are there variations also in policy responses to the shocks that the government actually made to the shocks in each of the countries, and that might also explain maybe how some of these firms actually behave during this pandemic. So sorry, you might have explained that, but I may have missed it. But thank you so much.
Yeah, it's fine. In the regression that we did, we control for the first stringency index. So the idea here is that the Oxford University, they have this composite index wherein they collect data and see how government responded to the pandemic. And then based on that, they create an index from 0 to 100. And so 100 being, the most stringent policy, like, you have a year lockdown in the UK. So that's stringent. And for some, like, Zimbabwe, for example, they didn't do any lockdown and they believe in something else like household steaming and whatnot. And so, yeah, you have variation in that. And we control for that in the regression. We also control for the how far is the survey was the survey conducted from the peak in terms of the mobility. So Google has a data set on mobility, and so how far are you from the peak? Meaning, when the mobility drop, that's a proxy for lockdown, and that's probably reliable. And so we also control for that because the surveys were done in different time periods, and so definitely we have to look into that as well. Those are the question. Oh, in terms of policies, yes, there are variations, and I didn't really present it in detail, and so in terms of policy received, there's a huge variation ranging from tax holidays, unemployment benefits, deferment in liabilities. The macroeconomic policies like increased liquidity, we don't include that as a firm level um, support, but we have variations in there. And then there's also the analysis or results looking at which policies were given as opposed to which policies are actually preferred by the firm. And we see that there's a mismatch as well. And why, again, based on what we have seen in terms of policies targeting, I mean, for the most part, policymakers are just using what is easily observed, like size and sector. But within those groups, you have huge variations. And so depending on what shocks actually you experience, and shocks could be different even if you belong to a particular size or subsector group. That could explain the heterogeneity of the impact for the most part.
You.
Okay. Let me call first Professor Nori Tarui from Hawaii, who raised his hand earlier, and then Dr. Carl Landok, and then back to Raul again. Nori?
Oh, yeah. Oh, hi, Arlan. Yeah, thanks for the interesting presentation. Yeah. My question is about one of the points you made about like farms in South Asia lagging behind in like digitalization adjustment. And I was wondering if the extent to which farms can adjust depend on to what extent they are already introducing digitalization at the pre-pandemic level. I don't know if this question applies to this context, but if farms are already digitalized, right, then there's not much room for like further adjusting the digitalization efforts during pandemic. Would that be an issue here or not?
Oh, definitely it's an issue, especially for India, who is really the leading country in terms of knowledge process outsourcing or KPO. So they have really huge investments in terms of digitalization. Well, that may be the case, and yes, it could be a reflection of how far they are in terms of the innovation or infrastructure development in terms of IT related services. But again, we control for a lot of things here, like subsector and country and region fixed effects and all that, and that should take care of that. But at the firm level, we're looking at the average, and so and then we're also looking at the region wide. So India could be the leading one, and it could be an outlier, and that could force the average predictive margin higher. But the neighboring countries like Maldives and Sri Lanka and Bhutan, these guys have lower investment in terms of per capita. I looked at the World Development Index, and so their per capita investment in terms of servers and subscription to broadband, they are lower than the world average, and so that pretty much explains the lower adjustment in terms of um, digitalization. But yes, I mean India definitely is an outlier in this region.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Nari. Dr. Carl Doc, Carl.
Hi, Arlan, you look good as ever. Mukhang hiyang na hiyang ka dyan sa UK, ah. So, I literally caught just the tail end of your presentation, Arlan, but my questions or comments, hopefully, you can say something about it, but if you have addressed it, then sorry. But in in your data set, do you have any measure of some sort of nimbleness of shifting to products? For example, if manufacturers of liquor can easily shift to high demand during COVID products like alcohol, something like that. Is there any measure in your data set so that would have an impact on firm performance? Second comment is that I think recovery also depends on parts of the world that have recovered. For example, if vaccine is, I mean, majority of the population is vaccinated in other parts of the world, so demand for products from that part of the world would impact like trade from countries in your data set. So, did you consider that um, in your in your in your study, or similarly, competition from countries that are hit, like in the Philippines now? I think we should be aware of the opportunity that this is probably not right to say, but uh, the virus that hit India, the variant, I mean, it would take time for them to recover. So the Philippines should be thinking of which industries would be, amenable to steal away from India, things like that. So, um, did you consider this like recovery from trade partners elsewhere in the world, or like how bad the trade partners are hit? And also, the first question was, do you have any measures of nimbleness of shifting of products that could point to faster recovery or lesser decline? That's all, Arlan. Nice to see you.
Yeah, you look good as well.
Pambahay na.
Are you sure?
But so on the first question, the product innovation. So yeah, we have questions about whether they were able to shift. So this is not, we're not measuring ability. Okay,
Mhm.
so it's probably hard to measure, but we're actually looking whether they actually
Shifted.
innovated, shifted
Okay.
to a
Mhm.
sort of similar. And there are anecdotal evidence, especially in Bangladesh, who's we all know is a leading country in terms of export of garments and textile, and
Mhm.
they resort to producing actually PPEs. Uh, so yes, we have that in the question, and we see that South Asia is actually on the average lagging behind in that area.
Yeah. Okay.
So we did that. In terms of competition or vaccination, or whether the rival country or the export destination, if you will, has been vaccinated, so that will be that will the recovery of firms or the trajectory will be dependent on that. I should clarify that this study is just wave one. So
Okay.
the data set will come in wave two. Actually, there's wave three, which is far more exciting. So in wave one, this is just a very quick survey. They needed to provide some study for the country management units, and so whatever is easy, and based on what we can use based on the World Bank Enterprise Survey, So those are the things that we did, and competition is not included in that module,
Mm-mm.
fortunately, and also the export destination and foreign ownership. So basically, we just looked at the very minimum, size, sector,
Yeah.
gender, ownership, and all that. Now in wave two, which data is now starting to come in, and we're doing some reports on the wave two. So now we can look at changes in the composition. There's also questions about whether they observe increased competition within their industry, and so that will be really interesting to look at. But that will happen probably in the next few months. So that
It's
was
okay.
the next project. But yeah, definitely these are interesting things to look at. And if you have other ideas that we can put on,
Yeah.
we're doing wave three. Hopefully, this is the
Sure. We can talk.
post-pandemic.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they're keen to involve people and what the module would look like. A very
Great.
interesting topic is 100,000 firms, so that's
Yeah.
quite something.
Mm-mm. Thank you, Arlan. Nice seeing you.
Nice seeing you too.
Professor Babella is raising his hand. Raul, do you still have one question?
Hello. You used stringent in March last year. Chances are your performance against COVID is very good. If you are stringent in November, then that response is already endogenous to the problem that in your lab. Whereas if you were in March, you were still facing the birthing of the pandemic. So I think that the stringency index should be looked at differently depending upon when it actually peaked. Because my hypothesis is if your stringency index peaked in March, your performance will actually be very good because you were hitting the pandemic while it was just being birthed. No. The other comment is there is a country that did not lock down, and that is Sweden. How did the firms behave? Now,
That's it.
that is and the third is this. Do you know that the Philippines passed a bill called CREATE, where the the so-called stimulus was directed towards corporations. You reduce the corporate income tax, and that's about 40 billion this first year and 625 billion in the coming 5 years. Do you know of any other country that directed their, in a sense, their effort towards large corporations rather than small corporations or small enterprises? So this is probably the opposite of what you would expect, because from your study, you know that large corporations are generally more resilient. They have, like you said, networks, connections, they have deep pockets. But in the Philippines, the large corporations got the bulk of the subsidy from the government. Oh, not subsidy, but it's not a subsidy, but the paluwag from the government. Do you know of any other countries that did the same?
Wow, those are really interesting questions, and I wish I could dig deeper and have a more satisfying answer. But for
No, that's all right. That's all right. It's
I'll first address the
there are there.
yes, the other bits. So yes, the stringency. The stringency and then severity index, we controlled for it. Now, of course, this one is based on wave one survey. So it's a one shot, and we don't know what's going to happen during the pandemic. And as we know it, the pandemic has become multimodal. So you have second wave, third wave, and whatnot. Other governments have responded to it with lockdowns, with mini lockdowns. I don't know. Philippines has several types of lockdowns or quarantine or whatever. So that one is really hard to look at. However, hopefully in wave two, we will be able to look at that over time. And the good thing about wave two is that we are able to get responses exactly from the same firm. So we have the identifier, and we were able to create a panel. And so from there, we can tease out a lot of potential confounding factors. And hopefully that will have a much richer analysis. So yes, in project 2, we're going to do that along with South Africa. And hopefully that also
Good.
partially address Sweden. I don't know if we're going to do analysis on the Scandinavian countries. For now, the demand is for developing countries mostly. I'm not even doing anything on the East Asia Pacific, unfortunately. I wish I would do, because Philippines has a huge chunk in terms of the number of observations. Lots of missing observations as well, but they have pretty much covered a number of firms. So for now, we're doing South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. So hopefully, yeah. But I cannot think in terms of the policies towards the bigger size firms. I cannot think of a country right now doing the same thing. I guess I can't say that I know exhaustively the policies were implemented, but pretty much the literature is saying that the pandemic is actually impacting more the informal ones, and so these are really micro, smaller firms, and so. Yes, you're right that perhaps Philippines is actually moving against the sort of ideal. But of course, when I say ideal, this is based on what we have found in the study, and that remains to be validated with the data coming from the Philippines. Maybe it's different in the Philippines, but for now, the literature is, I think, clear that the pandemic is actually impacting the smaller informal ones than the more corporate ones. I guess that should happen in
I
terms of
think
the.
your intuition, I share your intuition.
Yeah, and then this is
I
the
think that
difference
on this issue, the Philippines is proving itself an exception that proves the rule.
It could also
East
be
Asia, I think, will come out very quickly, and the Philippines
right.
will be lagging again.
Yes,
Anyway,
I looked at the outlook, and it's
with the data set that you have, there's a lot to do.
Okay. Arlan, I'm just curious about the timing of the surveys that you are doing. So you have first wave, second wave, and third wave. Is that right? So
Yeah.
I'm just thinking in terms of natural disaster, right? Because you have the first wave, like in India, they said that they were able to manage the first wave very well. And then they just unfortunately opened quickly. And now they have this really bad second wave. So I'm just wondering if your second or third wave would have questions that would ask about the experience of those firms and how they handled it. Because in terms of disaster, right, you would ask the experience before and how they are able to, cope or adapt. And then the second time they experience it, they would be able to recover. Or there will also be an experience where they are still trying to recover, and then another disaster or a second wave hit again, and then they would, it's really going to be hard to recover. So I'm just wondering whether you have those type of questions in your succeeding waves of survey. And then also, what if there is another disaster, like here in the Philippines last year, we're experiencing the pandemic, and then we have two extreme typhoon. So that would also disrupt, supply chain. How would that, impact? Or if you have those kind of questions in your second or third wave of the survey?
Yeah, in terms of the timing, so wave one happened around March 2020, and then the second wave was implemented. The second wave, wave two, sounds like a pandemic, but the wave two happened around September, and so those are the time periods. And wave three is pretty much ongoing, the planning stage. So
So you
most
can
likely it's gonna be
other
this
modules.
year, right? So so that answers the first question. The second one is on the compounding disaster, and this is a big issue in the disaster literature because those who have experienced compounding disaster, I mean, for example, flooding compounded with landslides and all that, the effect is actually much larger and more persistent, and so the impact have a longer lasting effect. So there's a lingering effect. In this case, unfortunately, I don't think we have that in the module. And why? I guess the country management units didn't really think about it. So we don't have that. But I think we could control for that in a way by looking at or imposing time of survey fixed effects. And so, but that should be interacted with country. And so yeah, it's possible. I'm just not sure if we have sufficient degrees of freedom to tease that out, but definitely something to consider. So yeah, I'll think about that in the next project.
Okay, so are there any more questions from the participants in Zoom or in Facebook? Any other questions? Okay, so before we end, let me share with you our next seminar, which will be on May 26th. So this will be the last seminar for this semester. It will be on benefit and cost of watershed protection in Hawaii. And our speaker is Dr. Kimberly Burnett from the University of Hawaii Economic Research Organization, or UHIRO. And all the materials from the seminar, including Arlan, presentation slide, right, and recording will also be posted in our website. So this time,